Welcome to the Irish Occupational Therapy Podcast, hosted by me, Jen Trechek.
And me, Aileen Rutledge.
This podcast is dedicated to exploring the world of occupational therapy, sharing the latest research and techniques and providing insights into the many ways that occupational therapy can help people of all ages live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Whether you are a practicing occupational therapist, a student of occupational therapy, or simply curious about this fascinating field, this podcast is for you. We'll be interviewing experts in the field, sharing stories from the front lines of occupational therapy practice, and providing tips and advice for anyone looking to get the most out of their therapy.
So sit back, relax, and join us on this exciting journey into the world of occupational therapy in Ireland.
We're excited to welcome Gina Davies on the Irish Occupational Therapy Podcast today. Gina is the creator of two widely used programs, Attention Autism and the Curiosity Program, which are used by therapists, parents, and education professionals internationally in supporting autistic children and young people. Gina is a highly specialised speech and language therapist, passionate about providing joyful and motivating opportunities for connection and engagement. You're very welcome, Gina.
Hi, it's very tempting to quit while I'm ahead.
It's an impressive introduction. We're so excited to have you with us.
That's very kind. I feel it's a privilege to be invited.
Great, Gina. Gina, we'll start off. What about giving us a brief synopsis of how you came to specialise in autism throughout your career? And what is it about autism that interests you?
You know, I'd like to say that it was a very considered decision, but it more or less happened by accident. And some of the language I'm going to use now, it shows how old I am. So in my first job, so I qualified as a speech and language therapist, and my first job included a couple of days at a hospital and home for the mentally subnormal, which, you know, that's, you're not supposed to talk about those things anymore, but that was definitely what it was. And I was desperately underprepared, though wildly enthusiastic, and, determined to make a difference. And I went into the job unsupervised. It was a residential hospital for 600 patients, as they were called then.
Wow.
And the reason I took that job was because it was one of the few hospitals that had a school. And I thought that, that's forward moving. We'll have a go at that. And I would go into the school in the morning. And as I went, I would see one lot of children being trooped off in a different direction, not very many of them, and I said, where do those children go? Why aren't they going to school? Oh, those are the autistic ones. They're ineducable. And I thought, well, that's, very interesting.
Wow.
Once I'd kind of got my feet under the table, I said, can I go and have a look? And I was very interested because autism wasn't mentioned in my training because it was considered so rare. I was very unlikely to come across it. And I thought, wow. Here's an opportunity to really learn something. And I went to have a look, and the kids were on a ward with practically nothing in it, a couple of TVs in cages at the top of the walls on either end, sound turned off. And the kids really just went up and down the ward all day. And I remember thinking that I felt very uncomfortable with that, but it was the care model, really. They were patients and they were being cared for. Most definitely not educated, and there was no expectation for that, except that the head of the school was very open to the idea that maybe it was possible. So I became more and more intrigued, but it was very difficult to find anyone in my own profession that really knew what to do about it. Eventually I managed to find people who could describe it, could help me understand how I might be a part of a diagnostic team, but the actual what do you do with them was totally lacking. And I began to get quite intrigued by that from very early on. I didn't have any success. I don't think I made a scrap of difference to those kids, unfortunately. In my next job, I would have a child brought in by a parent who would completely wreck the room. And I'd think, I think it's like one of those children who I know, get down to their level and make sure they look at you, which was the best advice at the time. And then I'd put them on review for 6 weeks, cross my fingers like mad and hope they were better. And 6 weeks later, they'd come back and do exactly the same thing. So I realised that what I was doing was making no difference at all. I certainly wasn't helping the parents. So the next job I took was at one of the first schools for autistic children, which was in Surrey. And I was very lucky in that the teachers in that school were prepared to teach me how to do it because I still had no idea. And I loved that job. I left at one point to have a baby, then went back, and then stupid, I had another one, went back again after that, and was then given an opportunity by a new head teacher to run a group, to run a class group, because she wanted to move away from the withdrawal model of speech and language therapy, which was basically take the child into a small room, do your very best with no witnesses, and then pop them back in the class, which was the standard model. So we thought, yeah, and I had a speech therapy colleague working with me by that point, and we thought, okay, speech and language therapists were always better than everybody else. So we can do
Game
this.
on.
We can show everybody how to do it. It's going to be fabulous. And I mean, we were on our knees by the end of the first week. You can't leave the room to do a bit of multidisciplinary working, write notes. You can't go for a wee, none of those things. You've got to stay in the room and do it day after day. And it utterly convinced me that speech and language therapy that was separated in any way from what was happening in the child's day was a waste of time, actually. It had to be something that was integrated into all the interactions and the kind of way you created the environment that would really support the child. And I guess that was the start of it.
And also, I suppose what we're, slowly coming towards as occupational therapists in our profession too, that withdrawal method, going off and doing your magic in another room where nobody sees. How useful is that?
Well,
in Ireland, we're starting to use a term called the school inclusion model,
right,
created by the NCSE, and that's again similar to what you're describing there, where therapists work with the education professionals, with the children in their environment, and everything changes around the child rather than working on the child or trying to change anything specifically about the child.
Or it being something only you can do.
Yeah.
Which I think, that was definitely a mistake I made. I'd done the 3 years and, I had the fix it. Don't you worry, I'll show the child how to do this. And it was only when I was struggling to get a child to go to the toilet that I thought, how do you manage pants, a preschool child and a visual at the same time? It's working through the practicalities of this that really make you think. It's easy to give people advice, but it very rarely sticks. Why not? Because it doesn't work. You can't do it.
It's so important, the parental role in that as well, and understanding from their perspective. I think we can have a really lovely, this is the plan you need to follow. And then life hits the parent and there's no way I think you mentioned taking time out to have children. I know for me that completely changed my perspective on what's possible and doable, and the asks that we're making of people. We absolutely need to understand the child in their context and everything else that's going on around them and what's realistic.
And what the expectations are. If you give a piece of advice that's actually in conflict with somebody's fundamental belief, they may be very polite and say yes, but they won't do it.
Yes.
And they'll come back again and again, hoping you're going to change the advice without actually saying to you, I would never do that to my child.
Yeah.
I think it's the harder route for a therapist. It's easier to do the withdrawal method. It's easier to give the advice. It's easier to be the consultant.
Yes.
It's harder to actually get down and roll your sleeves up and work alongside parents and professionals and put it all practically into practice in everyday life.
And be prepared to make a mistake and to go, no, that doesn't work. How could we, I think the threat as a therapist is often you feel you've got to come up with the solution, whereas sometimes you have what you think will work based on research or what you've tried before. You have the parental expectation, you have the child. Somehow you've got to get all three to come together, and then you've got to do it and keep doing it for long enough. And that is a heck of a challenge. It's very tempting to pretend you know what you're doing, because it's loss of professional faith. Whereas to go, "Ooh, crikey, that was a complete no-no, wasn't it? That seems to have made it worse. Not going to learn anything when he's in that kind of state. Let's have a cup of coffee and a rethink." I think that requires quite a lot of courage, actually, because you're failing.
Definitely. It's definitely confidence to be able to say, actually, maybe I haven't got all the answers, and to sit with that uncertainty. And, I think particularly in the system that we work in, there's such an expectation or a need to have the answer. And we were talking earlier about programs, and if I just do this, then I'll get this outcome.
Yeah.
But actually, in reality, there's never one magic answer. If there was, somebody would be making a lot of money by selling that magic answer. It's not there.
And the temptation is to sell the magic answer idea. I think we all get very, I love a project. Come on! I get very excited, commit for hours to, getting myself organized, learning the new skills. Here we go, toot toot, we're off. The maintenance is less interesting to me. And that's the bit actually where the hanging on in there and doing it again and again and making it a part of your daily practice change is difficult. And that's where a lot of people drop out of the whatever system you're using. Yeah, we did visuals. Yeah. What's next? And you go, no, thing is, visuals are for life in some form or other, same as they are for you and me. It's not like we did picture timetables for 6 months. We don't need to do them anymore. And that's hard. It's not so exciting for those of us that like the early stages and the project.
Speaking of projects, you created Attention Autism, and I'd not heard of Attention Autism until Aideen did an amazing presentation at the AOTI conference and kind of shared a little bit of what it might be like, and started bringing it into the world of occupational therapy. But it's very firmly rooted in your experience. Can you just tell us, how that evolved and what was the process there?
Well, of course, you've seen one of the best proponents of it. So, Aideen is quite remarkable, and it was Aideen that really saw the overlap with OT in a way that I hadn't really appreciated before. OT is a rare species in the world that I worked in. You were lucky if you saw one, a bit like Halley's Comet, really. But where did it come from? It came from inheriting a clinic which was full of action picture cards and revolutionary photograph cards. That was the most exciting bit of equipment. Snap, some other bits of equipment. And I remember thinking, I am bored to death by my own therapy. I can't think how anyone who was less readily socially engaged would put up with this. The neurotypical children would do it because they love the sort of sitting in the glow of one-to-one interaction with you. But for anybody else, I'm thinking, why am I doing this? Who cares whether the boy is running? This is not, the dog is pooing is much more interesting. We're only going to see that, somewhere where it shouldn't happen. Is that I thought the therapy was very, very boring. And for those children who were less readily engaged, it became an act of coercion. Now, I'm not terrifically good at responding to being coerced myself. I'm not saying I'm naturally non-compliant, but I do find it much easier if something's entertaining or fascinating to be engaged, and I'll be prepared to take more of a risk. If I'm really involved in something, I will take more of a risk. And actually trying something new, whether it's a word or a phrase or using your voice or pointing to a picture, that can be a risk for a child. It's got to be worth it from the child's point of view. So I began to look at my therapy thinking, if I was the child, would I think this was worth it? And to be honest, the answer was no. A lot of the time, the things that worked were the things that went wrong. When you dropped the cards all over the floor and skated about on them or something like that. So I began to look at small children from a totally different point of view. What were they doing? When was their concentration best? When did they stick with something even though it was difficult? And then I came across the Moody and Raynell, or Raymell and Moody, I can't remember which way around it is, their attention scales. And I looked at those and I thought, that's really interesting, because there are a couple of elements in that which are very familiar to me when I'm working with autistic children, in that the attention is fantastically focused if the child finds it engaging, and they will stick with that and pursue it actively. I need to get my therapy into that position. So I started to look at things that I thought might appeal to them. Lots of colour, movement, not just trains, which was the big thing at one point in my career. It was you must follow the child's interests, which meant a lot of trains, and I'm not very interested in trains, so I didn't sell that very well. But to look at what aspects of activities engaged the child, and to stop worrying about whether we were doing small world play or duplicating sequences in the day, and just to really go for it at what we used to call the exploratory play level, now I think more called sensory play, and to just experiment. And I was very lucky. By that point, I had opened, with a colleague, I'd opened a nursery for children with autism or something that looked like it, didn't have to have a diagnosis. So we were able to give ourselves license to experiment and to really try things. And the parents, God bless them, they said go for it. And that it began to evolve within that nursery. And we thought we have a model that works, but it is a bit of a Rolls-Royce model, and we needed something that was more applicable as the children were moving increasingly into mainstream. So in the next phase of my career, I looked at developing the ideas into a program, and that's really where Attention Autism came into being. And it takes a while, and it's still changing, as it should, as we learn more, as the research comes to the fore, as we particularly begin to hear the voice of the neurodivergent autistic individuals. We need to be open to the fact that although you've got a program which works, is that it's not set in stone. It should adapt, and it should mesh with other elements of programs that work successfully. It's not like ditch all that, do this instead. It's what would we bring if we added this?
A framework, I suppose, Gina, to work from, and a set of kind of guidelines and thinking processes. And what I really love about it is that attention to the strengths of the autistic individual. So what do they really persevere with? What really captures their interest, as you mentioned earlier? And then we generally, as practitioners in leading attention autism sessions, enjoy it as well, because it is so enticing. And
I think that's critical, because we know what structures and what methods can make a difference, but successful programs only work if people actually do them. If the person doing it doesn't like it, it's a chore, that's very quickly communicated to where it is placed in the day. It's put at the end of the day when the child's already flagging, so we just got to do this. Or it's done with that kind of, this is, if you do this, you can have 10 minutes on the iPad. It's something the child needs to be rewarded for. And I'm thinking, no, it needs to be something the child enjoys in its own right. It should, if I'm hoping philosophically, I'd be thinking, we want to create a love of learning that will last for life, that the child is intrigued with the process of finding things interesting and fascinating and remembering them. I suppose that sounds a bit whimsical, but that's where I'm heading.
Yeah, fits very well with the Montessori model of teaching.
Well, the person who I set up the nursery with originally was Montessori trained. So it most definitely has that influence in it, yeah.
Gina, you spoke earlier about earlier on as a speech and language therapist, how some of your interventions or your approaches didn't interest yourself. For any therapists, and you and I actually have discussed how sometimes children's OTs do take a more laborious approach to things, and some of our activities aren't that interesting. What advice would you give to any therapists listening that need a bit of inspiration with building rapport and connection when working with autistic children?
I think it would be to accept that change is difficult. And it's not the child who's brought themselves to you. It's usually the parents or the teachers that think something needs to be developed or supported. So the child isn't necessarily signed up to the process. They didn't decide to do it most of the time. So I think change is difficult. So I was given an example to a parent, and I said, okay, I know you walk on two legs. I know you can do that. But really, the new thing is hopping on your right leg only. You don't need to use your left leg anymore. It'll take a bit of practice, but don't worry. But this is the new thing. Okay. Now, if I was really convincing, I'm pretty sure that the parent would try hopping, but they know walking on two legs works. So how long would they hop for?
Yeah.
Would they only hop if I was watching? Would they hop every day? Or would they actually go back to walking on two legs? And it's not about lack of motivation. It's that change is difficult. You have to do it over and over and over again for it to become standard, everyday practice. This is what I do. I no longer walk on two legs. I only walk on one. And then to convince somebody else to do it, I think if we accept that change is difficult, but perhaps what makes change more appealing is if the person suggesting it is utterly committed to the process themselves. If they are going for it, taking the risks and doing it, I think that's very convincing. So it's partly who is training your colleagues who are struggling a bit, perhaps, and what is giving them the confidence to try something new, to take that risk themselves, because it's not going to be easier. It's most definitely going to be more work than a worksheet coming off a photocopier. But I think witnessing it, that's, seeing it in action, that's convincing. Hearing people who are doing it talk about it as soon as we produce a bucket, the kids run to sit down. Well, for my money, that's kids voting with their feet. And if somebody says to me, oh, our children hate attention autism, I'm thinking, there's something fundamentally flawed with the way it's being delivered. Not there's something wrong with the children. There's something wrong with the process of delivery, because it should be appealing in its own right. If you can hit that feeling of connection with a child, you can't. I'm not even sure you can equate. How would you measure that out of 10? You couldn't, because it's in that moment you think, I've got them.
Yeah.
And they have got me. It's a 50-50 process, that feeling connection. But it doesn't come easily. And people say, oh, you get connected with autistic children so easily, Gina. I go, well, do you know, I've been doing it for over 40 years. It's nothing magic. It's just, I've done a lot of it. And like anything else, if you've done a lot of it, it looks easier. Doesn't always work, I can tell you. It's just
I think the experiential piece is so helpful. I know, so for anybody who wasn't at the occupational therapy conference, what Aideen did is come up on stage with a box that nobody knew what was in it, and got out a watering can and plastic and paint, and hardly said a word. And so she was coming up to give a presentation. We all thought about attention autism, but she barely spoke, and she just did these activities. And the whole room was, you could hear a pin drop. Everybody's eyes were on her. They were completely engaged, going, what is this woman doing? Why is she doing this? What's coming next? It was so interesting. And I think Aideen could have come up and talked about that until the cows come home, but we would never have experienced it. And I think that's really key in terms of what you're saying. You need somebody to feel it, to be able to understand it a little bit more.
You do. And it's, people want everything measured, don't they? And how would you measure that feeling? I think that's professionalism. And I admire Aideen's work hugely. And she is extremely professional with a really good dollop of passion and creativity. Hurrah! Best combination on the planet. I don't think it's just about the science, it's about the artistry as well. Yeah. How do you get the ideas across? It's not just about, you're not giving somebody medicine from a bottle that you can measure.
Gina, could you share with us a success story, some moment in time that really stands out where your tools of attention autism, the curiosity program, we haven't spoken a lot about it, but a time that you had that connected moment, that really powerful moment with a child and a parent maybe as well, together?
Gosh, I'm very fortunate in that I've had quite a lot of those, but I think that's because that's been what I've done 5 days a week. I suppose for me, at one point, I took what for me considered a big risk, which is trying an older age group. So I undertook a project in a school for sort of 14, 15, and 16-year-old boys. They were all boys who'd been out of school for a very long time, had a diagnosis of autism, and who were in a very specialist provision, certainly students who were finding life very difficult. And I remember walking into the room thinking, right, okay, I'm used to, under sevens. Let's see how this goes. And I had my box of tricks, which I thought I would have found interesting at that age. And I remember two students looked at each other and a row set off straight away. It was like that kind of, he looked at me and she looked at me and, and he looked at me funny and they're all off. And I'm thinking, I don't even know where to start because I can't keep them in the room. And the temptation was to discuss it. And I thought, no, actually, I have to just commit. And so I did an activity which involves exploding film pots with squirts of paint on the top. Not one to be recommended unless you've checked the height that you will achieve on that. And it just brought the two students who'd left the room back in long enough to be in the room for us all to go, wow, and to watch the final pot go off together. And I thought, well, I think we can do this. I think we can. Now is the time to talk to the staff team about why I'm doing it like this. It's a frequent occurrence in my career for people to go, yes, but do you do proper speech therapy as well? And I go, the thing is, I've never managed to make what most people think of as proper speech therapy work with this group. Whereas I find doing things like this creates an interest in communication and into that shared process, which is why I do it. How about we give it a try? A lot of people go off and have proper speech therapy as well. That's fine. That's fine. I have no objection to that. But yeah, it's just that wonderful moment. And we know it works physiologically. If you feel connection, you get a squirt of the feel-good chemicals physiologically. It's not just a whimsy in my head. I feel it, and so will the child.
That connection is such, and relatedness is such a key part of motivation to do anything and to make any change, isn't it? If I feel a connection with the person who's asking it of me, I'm so much more likely to want to do something differently.
Exactly, as opposed to commit to refusing, which is, so often you think, no, this child's totally committed to refusing to do this. We're now engaged in something that is totally different to where we should be going. And the only thing that will be remembered is that friction and tension.
Do you work alongside parents with attention autism, Gina? How do they respond, or how can they support?
Yeah, it is a bit different. You get a license sort of as a professional to do things a certain way. I mean, I'm a parent myself. I know that I have wrestled with various things with my own children in a way that I wouldn't have struggled like that. So it being your own child changes things because you have all sorts of feelings wrapped up in what you're trying to do. You will be more committed than anybody else because you are, this is your child. But it makes, I think, making any change feel much riskier. Am I risking my relationship with the child? It's already, I'm perhaps struggling to feel really connected in the way that I thought I might do. Things are different. That doesn't mean to say the parents are not prepared to do it. It just means it's a whole lot of stuff to take on board and process. So I think very often one is saying, how does this sit with you? This is the idea I'm trying to put across. Like, for example, one of the things that often causes misunderstandings is in stage 1, you are showing the child a series of things out of your bucket or container, whatever, your box, and you're sharing them with the child from a visual point of view, but you're not going to give them to the child. And this is a little bit about helping the child understand you can powerfully connect with something and share it without necessarily having your hands on it. Because as life goes on, you're not always allowed to have the things you like. So it's very quick. It should engage the child very powerfully. They should enjoy it. But as a parent, the conflict of not giving your child something that they're showing enthusiasm for can be overwhelming. And that can give rise to a very powerful feeling of conflict about what's right. So we need to take care to explain why, from our point of view, this is an effective way to work. We are not torturing the child, tempting the child, none of those things. We're going to share something with the child quickly that they can look at and enjoy, and then we're going to put it away, because later on that will help them understand how to watch something in order to learn how it could be done differently, or in a more complicated way, or as a part of a sequence that would lead them on to further development. If you've learned how to learn by watching, which plays to a strength. I mean, that is, if you can learn to learn by watching, you've taken out so many complications, and virtually anything you can make visual, the child can learn. Wow, I mean, that opens up whole new vistas for some of these children.
Yeah.
I think. What do you think?
Absolutely. But I can understand from a parental perspective, we get stuck in habits that seem to work and we're afraid to let go of them. And, the idea of making new channels, it's terrifying, because even though it might not be exactly where I want things to be in terms of my relationship, at least it's comfortable and I know where I stand. So it's
familiar.
tricky.
And it will always have worked at some point, or you wouldn't have done it. So
exactly,
the parent has the evidence of their own experience. It's just, I suppose, we need to be really careful that we don't underestimate the children. Perhaps speech is coming later. Perhaps an obvious understanding of language is less in evidence. But we should not underestimate them, because very often they can do that on the iPad. He's only 2. Now, they may not understand an explanation that Granny's coming, so put your pants on. Or it may be that they don't fancy doing it, of course, because they are only 2. But we should not underestimate. There's so much that can be done. A child can learn so much. And language might come later, or communication might come in another format. But if you don't keep feeding in all the fascinating aspects of the world that we live in, you're not giving the child the material to process in the first place, would be my
and I think it's that longer term outcome as well, isn't it? We like immediate gratification, and I do this and I see the results now, and that's where we're always looking for the answer. And it sounds like you've really seen that over your career, that actually time and repetition, and someday that kind of aha moment will happen and it'll all fit into place and it will all have been worthwhile.
Or
but
at least you're creating the opportunity for it to happen. Don't compromise what might come further down the line by not doing it now because somebody said, or because you think somebody said he doesn't understand anything. Maybe not by that route, but what about this one? That would be the thinking, is people go, he doesn't need any more speech therapy because his communication matches his other abilities. I know, but there's life to be lived.
You mentioned occupational therapists being like hen's teeth. We're trying to get more involved. But as occupational therapists, sometimes we get it wrong, or sometimes we take a bit of time to catch up. And there's so much power, I think, in learning from each other's disciplines. Working with speech and language therapists, physiotherapists, we can all learn something from each other's approaches without encroaching on each other's spaces. How do you feel speech and language therapy and occupational therapy complement each other? What can we do better in terms of working together for young people?
That's a very decent question. I would say the same comes from, I was almost going to say my side of the fence, but from the field of speech and language therapy. At one point, the ability to communicate was seen as the fix-it. We know that's not the case. And some of us knew that right from the beginning because it was obvious from our hands-on work. But there are fashions and waves of enthusiasm for various things in the field. I mean, I've been through a few of them, and some of them coming round again. You think, oh, look at that, this was around 10 years ago, it's coming back again, new shiny box, new name. And I think we need to become experienced in looking at a program or research and thinking straight away, so what does this mean in practice? What does this mean in terms of pencil grip or communication or education? I think there's massive overlap. I mean, the longer I'm in the field, the more I think the boundaries between the specialities are more blurred. It's just that perhaps you and I have spent more time studying different aspects of it, so we can bring a slightly different perspective. Same with education. We can't just waltz in and tell the teacher how to do it and give her all the responsibility for it. It's how does it mesh together so that we can combine things in order to make what's happening around the child more effective. I mean, a classic one I used to struggle with an OT and seating. Okay. A few little red flags going there. Okay. So the OT comes in and goes, this one must be on a ball. This one must be on a rocking chair. This one needs to be on a stool. And this one needs to be like this. And I go, I know, but when I look at it, they're all at different heights and they can't communicate with each other, because if they turn, which would be, that would be a big thing for this child. If he turns, he's looking into space because the child next to him's on a ball which is much lower down, and I go, but it doesn't, you can't do that. And I think, no, wait a minute, what it needs to do is to sort out, why does the OT want them to sit like this, and why do I want them to sit so that it's easy to engage each other visually? Because there has to be a solution. It would be bonkers if there wasn't. But instead of it being one person coming in doing this and one person coming in going, I don't think so, is when you go, what were you aiming for? Because if the OT had said to me, what are you aiming for? And I'd go, easy connection. That's what I want. I want any connection to be easy for them to achieve. And if she said, yeah, and if they're stable when they're seated, they'll be more grounded, that will help. Right. Let's saw the legs off the chair or whatever. Or get a bigger bouncer ball, or
we will get that answer. I think so much of it is understanding, like you say, different perspectives and the roles, and then not being precious with our knowledge. My background in some fields, there's a real sense of, this is my job, and you don't do occupation, or you don't do talking, or and if we understand more about each other's roles and draw on each other's knowledge base, then we can be much better all-rounded clinicians to meet the needs of the young person together.
Disciplinary approach, I suppose. Jen and I have both worked in services that use that model, and it is so helpful because, again, we're spending time with the child, and your session can overlap, and you can bring those strengths from each of the professions through to benefit the child.
You can, and I think so much of it needs to be done hands-on, not the discussion separate, but in the room where you want it to happen. So you can see, yes, well, we could put 3 peanut balls in here, but nobody's going to be able to get away when this child is leaving swiftly because they need their own space. Or, no, you can't have your chairs set in a horseshoe. There is so much furniture in the room, or whatever it is. It's in context. It's one thing to discuss it in the office, translate it into practice. I mean, if I was going to give a parent a piece of advice, if they ever went for an appointment and were given some advice, is to say to the person, give it to them, can you show me? Can you show me?
It's a great idea, because again, that idea of things happening in the therapy room, and then how do you translate it into real life? And for the parents to see that absolutely is a great piece of advice going into any session.
I think for parents, so much of what they're told is complicated and at a time of stress, when they're worried about whether their child is behaving or stressed or getting upset or whatever. The other thing is, I would say to a parent, you can record everything I say on the phone. But they can't remember, or they're trying to relay it to a partner. They can't remember everything that was said, but you can press the play button. And people go, oh, but they might record you saying something. Well, if I've said something inappropriate, I deserve to be pulled up on it. If I'm not prepared for the parent to repeat word for word what I'm saying, there's something wrong with what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I've said the same, and I think it's so much more valuable than a huge long report that the parent can't make sense of, and there's so much language in there that is just kind of confusing. It's much easier to have that conversation and to have a record, and you can ask the questions that you want in a language that makes sense to you.
Because it should be a dialogue. A parent should be able to say, what do you mean? What do you mean? Does that mean I shouldn't put these shoes on? Or do you mean he's always got to wear this? Or should he be sitting on this peanut ball for everything? Or if it's a dialogue, some of which is genuinely shared, the information is bound to be more effective.
Gina, thank you so much for giving your time to us today. That was really helpful. Lots and lots of food for thought. And yeah, it was lovely to catch up again, Gina.
Thank you. And I think I would like to say thank you to all the kids and their families and the people I've worked with over the years for being so patient and for teaching me so much. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everyone I've worked with in the past.
That's all for today's episode on the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it informative and engaging. If you've any questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at irishotpodcast@gmail.com or connect on Instagram or Facebook.
And remember to subscribe to our podcast so that you never miss an episode. If you found this episode helpful, please leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback is important and helps us to improve the show, so please do leave it. Thank you for listening to the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast, hosted by myself, Jen Trechak.
And myself, Aileen Rutledge.
We look forward to sharing more insights and knowledge with you in future episodes. Until then, take care.